So we all love superheroes, right? Who's everybody's favorite superheroes? Spider-Man's good. I like Spider-Man. Scarlet Witch, that's a deep cut. A lot of people don't know who that is. I like that. Well, I guess more people know now because of WandaVision, but WandaVision? Okay. Yeah, but a lot of people don't know. She was never called Scarlet Witch in the Marvel movies. My favorite superhero, and I'd be really surprised if anybody knows who this is a guy named Ted Cord. Okay, well, you were here first hour, so you don't get any extra points for that. Theodore Daniel Cord. He is the Blue Beetle, the second Blue Beetle. There was Dan Garrett, Ted Cord, and then Jaime Reyes. All three had the name Blue Beetle, but they all had different power sets. Blue Beetle is my favorite. Ted Cord is kind of like Spider-Man meets Batman. He used a lot of gadgets and stuff. He was a kid. He was very acrobatic. And my favorite thing about Ted Cord was, like Batman, he was like this really rich guy. He inherited a bunch of money from his parents. He inherited a company that gave him the ability to create all these crazy gadgets. But instead of just taking all of that and becoming like super wealthy and just kind of sitting on his laurels, he saw the wrong in the world and he used the power that he had been given to do something, to change the world for the better. And that's why we all love superheroes, right? We all love superheroes because they're these bigger than life characters, but more than that, they're doing good in the world. They're changing the world for the better, right? That's why we love superheroes. And over the next few weeks, that's what we're going to talk about. We want to talk about changing the world and doing something about the injustices we see in the world. But before we can change the world, before we can do anything about the injustices in the world, first, let's get a couple definitions out of the way. First, let's define injustice. What is injustice? We've all heard the word justice, right? It simply means something is right or fair or equal. So injustice, it follows, would be the opposite of that. We're talking about the things in our world that are unfair, that are unequal, that just aren't right. And there are probably a lot of things you can think of when you hear about that, right? When you hear the word injustice, when you hear something that's unfair or unequal or not right. You think about starving children, you think about families living in poverty, you think about natural disasters or racism. And all of these things are very wrong, but if we're honest, we immediately think about these big things, and it feels like we can't really do anything about it because they're so big. Like racism has existed for thousands of years. Since the Tower of Babel, we've been making comparisons and inherently making judgments based on the way people look or the way people sound. Like starving children has always been a problem. Poverty has always been a problem. And they're too big. You can't think. It's the kind of stuff. The most obvious injustices in the world feel like things that we just can't tackle on our own. And we just have to, at the end of the day, we hang up our superhero cape and say, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to just accept it as it is, right? But what if I told you that you actually do have the power to do something about the wrongs that you see in the world? You have a lot more power than you realize. Right now, as a middle schooler, you have the potential to do something about the hurts, the wrongs, and the unfair things that you see in the world around you. So I want you to imagine dominoes. You guys have all seen like the domino videos, or you've played with dominoes, right? You set one in place, and then you set another one, and you set another one, you set another one, and you start with just the one domino. At the end of the day, you push that one domino over, and 1,000 different things can happen once you've hit that first domino down, right? You set each domino in a line, and then with one push of your finger, a huge chain reaction follows. And that's what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this huge potential that you have for the smallest act causing the biggest reaction. And whether you realize it, there are many injustices in the world, big and small, happening right now around you every day. Often they're either so big that we can't do anything about them, or we see all the big ones, but the little things kind of pass us by because they're not obvious. They're not huge, obvious wrongs. We just don't see them. We might question them or wonder why things happen, but we don't recognize that it's a true injustice. To us, it's just the way things are. Think about some of these things, right? Some people, like sports teams at your school, right? A lot of times there are fees involved with that. There's uniform fees and there are fees. Some people get to join a team because they can pay all the subsequent fees. Other people can't. Some people, they have to get help to pay for those. Some schools, like with the distance learning, a lot of schools, they're able to provide those those laptops for the kids that are now learning from home. A lot of schools don't have that. Some schools don't have the ability to give every single student a laptop to send them home and distance learn. Some middle schoolers get bullied every week, but nobody speaks up. And this one is especially, I want to point something out that a lot of people don't really think about. Like we always see, like in TV shows and all that, like the nerds get made fun of, right? Or the people, like the gamers get made fun of, but the jocks are the really cool kids and they're popular. Well, you know that actually does get flipped on its head sometimes? Like some of my best friends played football or wrestled in high school, and everybody just thinks, oh, they're the big dumb jock. But they're also some of the most intelligent people I know. They're the most sensitive, like emotionally cognizant people I know. But everybody just assumes that they're big dumb jock, they don't really care about other things, they're aggressive, they're mean, they're stupid. Like it goes both ways, right? People could have the exact same grades in their classes, but one is assumed to be smarter because of whatever reasons. It could be racism, it could be sexism, it could be like everything being equal, they're treated completely different. And now for some of you, some of the stuff on this list isn't brand new. Like I'm not telling you anything you didn't already know. You notice it because you've experienced it, or you know somebody who experiences it. You see it because you've lived it. For you, some of these injustices are very real. But for others, it may be brand new, that maybe this isn't something you've thought about before. The stuff that's happening in your school or your community or your neighborhood, but maybe you haven't noticed it, like, and put a name to it, but you've always felt like there is something off, right? The stuff is probably the result of some kind of injustice, some kind of unfair or unequal treatment of people. So what do we do about it? There is something inside most of us that wants to fix the problems with the world. We see a wrong and we want to fix it. The first step is in making things right is simply just seeing it. The first step is seeing that there is a wrong and recognizing it. If you haven't seen or experienced injustice, we have a really unique opportunity over the next few weeks to hear about some of the very real issues with the world and learn about the things we can do to help combat them. So let me let you in on a little secret. We're not the first ones to deal with this. We're not the first, you're not the first group of middle schoolers to see all the different things that are wrong with the world. We're not, my generation, we're not the first people to look at racism or sexism or all these other things that I've mentioned. We're not the first people to be like, we need to fix that. Since biblical times, there's been injustice in the world. Since biblical times, there's been people who are treated unfairly or unjustly for something they can't control. And I think that's part of the reason that Jesus made a habit of pointing out things to people that they hadn't seen or noticed before. So much of the ministry, Jesus' ministry on earth, was spent talking about the poor, helping people, and simply just recognizing the injustices in the world. And there was this guy named Matthew who actually experienced life with Jesus. And I think we've all, if we don't know who Matthew is, we've at least heard his name. It's the first book of the New Testament, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Matthew, he knew Jesus, he followed Jesus, he lived with Jesus, right? He wrote down a lot of what he saw. When we're reading his account of Jesus' life, we're reading it from somebody who actually saw and experienced firsthand what Jesus did in the world and what Jesus cared about and what Jesus saw and said and did. I think that's pretty cool, right? A first-hand account of Jesus walking on earth, I think that's pretty cool to know that there was this guy standing right next to him and got to see everything he had done. So in this particular encounter, Jesus was trying to help those who were listening to him understand that part of following him meant seeing and caring about the injustices in the world. And he does this by comparing the righteous people to the unrighteous people. And this is another one of those where we need to take a step back and define something. So a righteous person is somebody who does good and wants to help others. When we talk about unrighteous people, we're talking about people who don't do good and aren't wanting to help others. Now in chapter 25, it starts verse 34. Matthew goes on, he says, "Then the kings will say to those on his right," this is what Jesus said. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" So maybe you're hearing this and thinking what the people who were listening when Jesus said this were thinking, right? What is Jesus talking about here? When was Jesus hungry? When was Jesus thirsty? When was Jesus naked or in prison or all these other things? There's no stories about Jesus being persecuted, up to the cross at least, right? During his ministry, we don't see Jesus hungry or thirsty or naked or in prison. And the people listening when Jesus is saying this are probably thinking the exact same thing. What's he talking about? Well, you're right. Those injustices didn't happen directly to Jesus, right? And so his followers didn't really see them. They didn't recognize that responding to them might be important parts of showing their love for Jesus. But look at how Jesus responds when they ask this. Jesus says, "The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" So what Jesus is saying here, right? The righteous people, the people who want to do good in the world and want to help others are people who see and look for the injustices around them. They care about the least of these because that's how they show their love for God. They care about the least of these, which are those that need the most help, feel the most pain, or get the worst treatment. They recognize that when someone is hungry or thirsty or in need of clothes or sick or imprisoned or left out, they see the injustice in the way those people are treated. They see the injustice in their circumstances, and they care about it and they act on it. Because caring for those who are being treated as less than or left out shows your love for God. And it shows they care because God cares about the least of us, right? We reflect the love that God had for us by showing love to those that have and need that extra help. The people listening at the time probably struggled with some of the same things we struggle with today, right? They didn't see it. They didn't recognize it was happening around them. So the first step, before you can do something about injustice, you have to see it. It's easy to think that something you don't see isn't really there. It's easy to think if it doesn't affect me personally, then it must not actually be happening. The truth is the injustice is everywhere. And if you want to be people who do something about it, we have to start by seeing it. Before you can do something about injustice, you have to see it. Now, if you are experiencing any of these injustices that we've talked about today, I want to say that I'm sorry. What you've experienced isn't right or fair or good, but I don't want you to check out just yet. Because what you're experiencing matters, and we are going to talk about that in the coming weeks. But today, I want to focus on, we have to see injustice before we can do anything about it. So I think we're ready to start seeing the injustices around us. But where do we start? Move close enough to see. Everybody's been to the eye doctor, right? And you can picture the eye chart. It starts out really big. There's always that giant E, and then it gets progressively smaller. And it's a lot easier to see that chart when you're sitting 2 feet from it, right? It's a lot harder as you move further away from it. So the first step is move close enough to see it. We can't turn our eyes or shrug off when we see an injustice in the world. When we see something that makes us uncomfortable, we have to put ourselves in the position to see it. Maybe that means getting close to someone at school who is different than you, or talking to a few different trusted adults about some of the questions you have about the potential injustices that you see at your school or community or in your neighborhood or even at your church. It means asking God to help you see it, to change the way that you see people and circumstances around you. And then the second thing is be curious enough to learn. The quickest way to see an injustice is to listen to the people experiencing it. So when your friends come to you and say, hey, this is what's going on, just listen to what they're saying. Don't rush to fix it. Don't try to argue or explain it or justify in any way, or even just give your opinion, but just listen to what they're saying, right? Even if someone doesn't open up to you about the injustice that they're experiencing, there are still some ways you can learn about injustice from others. One way that you can do this week, pick one of the things that I've talked about. Pick one injustice that you've heard about today and maybe do some research on it. Look at the history of that in our society. And research some people or organizations that are doing good work to help fight that injustice. One of my favorite is homelessness. A lot of people experience that, and it's almost scary that how quickly somebody can go from being just fine to living on the streets, especially this last year. And some of this stuff is going to make you uncomfortable at first. It might be hard to hear about or difficult to see somebody that's experiencing it. And it's certainly awful if you're experiencing it yourself. You might struggle to understand it or recognize why it's so bad, or even agree that what someone is telling you is wrong or unjust. Don't shy away from the conversation because it's uncomfortable. And keep asking God to help you see injustice for what it is. That's the first step. Be curious about your own experiences too. Maybe there's some stuff that's happened in your past and for some reason it just didn't sit with you, but you didn't really think about it being an injustice. You didn't think about it. Or maybe you've even participated in an injustice or a wrong. You didn't understand what your comment meant, so you didn't see why it was such a big deal. You thought it was all good fun. You can't know what you'll discover until you get curious. So be curious about how injustice may be impacting your life and the lives of those around you. And if you want to do something about the injustice, we have to start with moving close enough to see it, being curious about what others have experienced with injustice, and thinking about your own experience. Now, like the dominoes, we always want to rush to get them set up and then knock them down, right? But we can't just set them up and knock them down in one swoop. We have to start. This is just the first step, is seeing the injustice around us. Maya Angelou, I hope a lot of you have heard of her. She was a famous woman who wrote a lot about injustice. She says in one of her poems, she says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." So that's our hope for this series, that you'll start with seeing the injustice around you. And that's just the first step. The first step is, before you can do something about injustice, you have to see it. So as we break off into our small groups, I want you to think about this week as you move through. What's one example of an injustice that you see in your school or your community or your neighborhood that maybe you haven't really noticed before?